My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 28 years old. I should probably start by saying that this isn't the story you think it is. When people hear about emotional abuse, they expect dramatic scenes, screaming matches, or visible bruises that tell the world something is wrong. But the truth is far more insidious than that. It creeps into your life like fog rolling in from the ocean, so gradual that you don't notice until you're completely lost in it, unable to see your own hand. In front of your face. It began on a Tuesday in September 3 years ago. I remember because I had just started my new job at Morrison and Associates, a prestigious marketing firm downtown. I was wearing my lucky navy suit, the one my mother bought me for my college graduation, and I felt like I could conquer the world. The elevator doors opened on the 15th floor, and there he was. David Chen, the regional director, standing in the lobby with his perfectly pressed shirt and that smile that made everyone in the office stop what they were doing. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was something magnetic about him. The way he commanded attention without raising his voice, how his dark eyes seemed to see straight through to your soul. When he shook my hand that first day, his grip was firm but not overwhelming, and he said, "Sarah Mitchell, I've heard great things about you. I have a feeling we're going to work very well together." I should have trusted my instincts. There was something in that moment, a flash of something I couldn't quite identify. But I was 25, ambitious, and hungry for success. When the most influential person in the office takes notice of you, you don't question it. You feel grateful. The first few weeks were everything I had hoped for. David included me in high-level meetings, sought my opinion on campaigns, and praised my creativity in front of clients. I felt special, chosen. My colleagues began to look at me differently, with a mixture of respect and envy that I mistook for admiration. I was rising faster than anyone had expected, faster than I had dared to dream, but success came with a price I didn't understand at first. David began staying late, asking me to join him for strategy sessions that stretched well into the evening. At first, these meetings felt like mentorship. He would share stories about his own climb up the corporate ladder, the sacrifices he had made, the people who had doubted him along the way. "You remind me of myself when I was starting out," he would say, leaning back in his leather chair as the city lights twinkled outside his corner office window. "You have that hunger, that drive, but you need to be careful. This industry will chew you up and spit you out if you let it." I hung on every word. Here was someone who had made it, someone who saw potential in me that others had missed. When he suggested I handle the Peterson account, our biggest client, I nearly jumped out of my chair with excitement. It was the kind of opportunity that could make my career. That's when the subtle changes began. David started scheduling our meetings for odd hours, sometimes calling me into his office at 7 in the morning or just as I was packing up to leave. He would critique my work with surgical precision, finding flaws in presentations that had impressed everyone else. But he always framed it as caring, as wanting me to reach my full potential. "I'm only hard on you because I believe in you, Sarah," he would say after tearing apart a campaign I had spent weeks perfecting. "The others, they're content with mediocrity. But you're different. You can be extraordinary if you're willing to do what it takes." The compliments felt like lifelines thrown to a drowning person. After hours of criticism, that single word of encouragement would make me forget everything else. I began to crave his approval like a drug, working longer hours, double-checking every detail, trying desperately to anticipate what he wanted before he asked for it. My friends started to notice the changes first. Emma, my college roommate, who had become my closest confidant, mentioned that I seemed stressed during our weekly coffee dates. "You're different lately," she said one Saturday morning, stirring sugar into her latte with more force than necessary. When was the last time you talked about anything other than work? I laughed it off, telling her she was imagining things. But the truth was, work had become everything. David had a way of making me feel like the Peterson account was not just my responsibility, but my identity. When I succeeded, I was valuable. When I made mistakes, I was letting everyone down. The isolation happened so gradually that I didn't notice it at first. David had a talent for making his demands seem reasonable, even necessary. He would suggest that I skip lunch with colleagues because we had important work to do, or he would schedule mandatory overtime on Friday evenings when everyone else was heading home to their families. Each time, he presented it as a sign of my importance to the company, my dedication to excellence. The others don't understand what it takes to succeed at this level, he would say, his voice taking on that conspiratorial tone that made me feel like we were partners in something significant. They're content to do the minimum and collect their paychecks. But you and I were building something here. The Peterson account is going to change everything for this company, and you're the architect of that success. I began declining invitations from friends, canceling dinner plans, and missing family gatherings. Every time I considered saying no to David's requests, he would remind me of how much he had invested in my career, how other people were waiting for me to fail so they could take my place. The fear of disappointing him became stronger than my desire for a life outside the office stopped my relationship with Marcus. A graphic designer I had been dating for 6 months became the first casualty. He was patient at first, understanding when I had to cancel dates or cut phone calls short because David needed something urgently. But as weeks turned into months, his patience wore thin. I feel like I'm dating a ghost, he said during what turned out to be our last dinner together. We were sitting in the small Italian restaurant where we had our first date, and I kept checking my phone for messages from David. You're physically here, but your mind is always somewhere else. When was the last time we had a conversation that didn't involve your boss? I wanted to explain, to make him understand how important my career was, how close I was to achieving everything I had worked for, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself defending David, explaining how much pressure he was under, how the success of the Peterson account could secure both our futures. Marcus looked at me with something that might have been pity. Listen to yourself, Sarah. You're talking about him like he's your boyfriend, not your boss. This isn't healthy. That night, after Marcus left, I sat alone in my apartment and tried to remember who I had been before David entered my life. The woman who used to paint watercolors on Sunday mornings, who read novels for pleasure, who could spend hours talking with friends about everything and nothing. That person felt like a stranger now, someone I had known in another lifetime. But by Monday morning, David's praise for a presentation I had stayed up all night perfecting made me forget about Marcus, about the loneliness, about everything except the intoxicating feeling of being valued by someone so important. The cycle continued, each day pulling me deeper into a reality where David's opinion was the only one that mattered. The Peterson account became my obsession. I knew every detail of their company history, every preference of their executive team, every competitor in their market. David encouraged this fixation, praising my thoroughness while subtly suggesting that anything less than perfection would be a betrayal of his faith in me. The Peterson presentation is next week, he announced during one of our evening sessions, his fingers drumming against his desk in a rhythm that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. Everything we've worked for comes down to this moment. I hope you understand the weight of what's resting on your shoulders. The pressure was immense, but I thrived on it. Or at least I thought I did. The truth was, I have forgotten what it felt like to exist without that constant tension, the gnawing anxiety that accompanied every decision, every word, every moment of every day. I had convinced myself that this was what success felt like, that the churning in my stomach and the sleepless nights were simply the price of achieving something meaningful. My family noticed the changes during Thanksgiving dinner that year. My mother kept asking if I was eating enough, if I was sleeping well, if everything was okay at work. My father, never one for emotional conversations, pulled me aside after dinner and said something that stayed with me for weeks. You know, sweetheart, I've been working for 35 years and I've never seen someone change the way you have in the past few months. Success is important, but not if it costs you who you are. I dismissed his concerns just as I had dismissed everyone else's. They didn't understand the corporate world, the demands of high-level marketing, the opportunities that were opening up for me. David had taught me that success required sacrifice, that ordinary people would never understand what it took to achieve extraordinary things. The Peterson presentation arrived like a storm I had been tracking for months, inevitable and terrifying. I had rehearsed every slide, anticipated every possible question, and prepared backup plans for scenarios that probably would never occur. David had scheduled 3 full dress rehearsals, each one followed by detailed critiques that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about marketing, about business, about myself. "Your energy is off," he said after the final rehearsal, his eyes scanning my face with the intensity of a scientist studying a specimen. "The clients will sense your uncertainty. You need to project absolute confidence, complete mastery of the material. Remember, their decision doesn't just affect this campaign. It affects your entire future with this company." I spent the night before the presentation staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through every possible way things could go wrong. When my alarm went off at 5 a.m., I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My hands shook as I applied my makeup, and I had to redo my lipstick 3 times because my fingers wouldn't stay steady. The Peterson executive team arrived at 10 o'clock sharp. There were 6 of them, led by Victoria Peterson herself, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. David made the introductions, positioning himself as the strategic mind behind the campaign while presenting me as the talented execution specialist who had brought his vision to life. The presentation went flawlessly. Every transition was smooth, every statistic perfectly delivered, every visual element timed to perfection. I watched the Peterson team's faces, seeing interest, then engagement, then what looked like genuine excitement. Victoria asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated she had been listening carefully, and her team members took extensive notes. When I finished, there was a moment of silence that felt like an eternity. Then Victoria smiled, the kind of genuine smile that transforms a person's entire face. "Ms. Mitchell, that was exceptional. You've clearly put tremendous thought and effort into understanding our company and our market position. I'm impressed." The meeting ended with handshakes and promises to be in touch within the week. As the Peterson team filed out of the conference room, I felt a surge of triumph unlike anything I had ever experienced. I had done it. I had delivered exactly what David had asked for, exactly what the company needed, but David's reaction was not what I expected. Instead of celebration, instead of praise, he simply nodded and said, "Good. That's what I expected from you. Let's see if they actually sign the contract before we start congratulating ourselves." The dismissal felt like a physical blow. After months of build-up, after all the pressure and preparation and sleepless nights, my moment of triumph was reduced to a single word: good. Not exceptional, not impressive, not any of the words Victoria Peterson had used. Just good delivered, in a tone that suggested he had expected nothing less. That afternoon, as I sat in my cubicle trying to process what had happened, David called me into his office. I expected him to finally acknowledge what we had accomplished, to share in the success that belonged to both of us. Instead, he closed the door and turned to face me with an expression I had never seen before. "I need to talk to you about your performance in there," he said, settling into his chair with the deliberate movements of someone about to deliver bad news. While the presentation went well overall, there were several moments where I could see your inexperience showing. Your nervousness was visible, especially during the Q&A session. I felt the words hit me like physical blows. Nervousness. I had handled every question with confidence, had seen the approval in the clients' faces, had received direct praise from Victoria Peterson herself. But David continued, dissecting my performance with surgical precision, finding flaws I hadn't known existed. Your voice wavered when Victoria asked about the timeline for implementation. You looked at me for approval instead of maintaining eye contact with her. These are rookie mistakes, Sarah. I had hoped you were past this kind of behavior. By the time he finished, I felt completely deflated. The triumph of the morning had been transformed into a catalog of failures, a reminder that I still had so much to learn, so far to go before I could truly call myself successful. David's final words echoed in my head for the rest of the day. "I'm not trying to be harsh. I'm trying to help you grow. But you need to be honest about your limitations if you want to improve." That evening, I called my sister Jennifer, desperate for someone to talk to who might understand what I was going through. Jennifer was 4 years older than me and worked as a nurse, someone who dealt with life and death situations every day. Surely she would have perspective on workplace pressure. "Sarah, you sound exhausted," she said after I had recounted the day's events. "When was the last time you took a vacation? Or even a weekend off?" I couldn't remember. The months had blended together into an endless cycle of work, criticism, and the constant pursuit of David's approval. When I tried to explain this to Jennifer, she was quiet for a long moment. "Honey," she said finally, "healthy bosses don't make their employees feel this way. Success shouldn't come at the cost of your mental health." But Jennifer didn't understand the corporate world, didn't understand the level of competition I was facing, the opportunities that were at stake. David had taught me that excellence required sacrifice, that comfort and success were mutually exclusive. Her concern felt like another voice trying to hold me back from achieving my potential. The Peterson contract came through on a Friday afternoon, 3 days after the presentation. It was everything we had hoped for and more, a 2-year deal worth $800,000, with options for renewal that could triple that amount. The entire office buzzed with excitement as news of the contract spread from department to department. I was in the middle of updating spreadsheets when David appeared at my cubicle, his face unreadable. "My office," he said simply, then turned and walked away without waiting for a response. My heart hammered as I followed him, uncertain whether I was about to be praised or criticized. He closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit. For a moment, he said nothing, just studied me with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face. "Congratulations," he said, but there was something in his tone that made the word feel less like praise and more like an acknowledgement of something he had always known would happen. "The Peterson contract is exactly what this company needed. You should be proud of your contribution, not your achievement, not your success. Your contribution to something larger, something that ultimately belonged to him." But I was so desperate for his approval that I seized on the word proud like a lifeline. "Thank you," I said, feeling a flush of warmth that had become as addictive as any drug. "I couldn't have done it without your guidance." David nodded as if this acknowledgement was simply a statement of fact rather than an expression of gratitude. "Now comes the real work," he said, leaning forward in his chair. "The Peterson account is going to require constant attention, daily. management, and absolute perfection in execution. One mistake could cost us everything we've built. The celebration I had been anticipating never came. Instead, David immediately launched into a detailed breakdown of everything that would be required to maintain the Peterson relationship: weekly check-ins, monthly reports, quarterly reviews, and annual strategy sessions. Each item on his list felt like another weight added to shoulders that were already struggling to carry the load. "I'm going to need you to take point on all Peterson communications," he continued, making notes on a legal pad as he spoke. "They've specifically requested to work with you, which is both an opportunity and a responsibility. Victoria Peterson doesn't suffer fools, and she has zero tolerance for mediocrity." Over the next several weeks, the Peterson account consumed every aspect of my life. David insisted that I be available at all hours, since Peterson Industries operated across multiple time zones, and Victoria herself was known for working late into the evening. My phone became an extension of my body, constantly buzzing with emails, text messages, and requests for immediate responses to questions that couldn't wait until morning. The work itself was rewarding, engaging, and exactly the kind of high-level strategic thinking I had always wanted to do. But David's management style turned every triumph into a near miss, every success into a reminder of how much more was expected. When Victoria Peterson sent a glowing email about a campaign we had launched, David's response was to point out the 3 small improvements she had suggested and worry about what those suggestions might mean for our future relationship with the company. "She's testing us," he said during one of our increasingly frequent emergency meetings. Those weren't suggestions, they were warnings. She's giving us a chance to prove we can adapt, can improve, can meet her evolving standards. We need to exceed her expectations, not just meet them. I began to see every interaction with the Peterson team through this lens of constant evaluation. Every email as a potential criticism, every request as a test I might fail. The confidence I had built during the presentation slowly eroded under the weight of David's relentless analysis of every word. Every gesture, every pause in conversation taught my health started to suffer in ways I couldn't ignore. I lost 15 pounds without trying, my appetite disappearing along with my interest in anything that wasn't directly related to work. Sleep became elusive, my mind racing through client communications and potential problems long after I should have been resting. I developed a persistent cough that I attributed to stress, and headaches that arrived with such regularity that I started carrying aspirin in my purse. During this time, Emma made several attempts to reconnect, suggesting lunch, dates, and weekend activities that I consistently had to decline. Finally, she showed up at my apartment on a Sunday morning, armed with coffee and bagels and a determination to have what she called an intervention. "Sarah, I'm worried about you," she said, settling onto my couch with the kind of directness that had made us friends in college. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks, you've lost too much weight, and every time I try to talk to you, you seem like you're somewhere else entirely." I wanted to explain everything to her, to tell her about the pressure and the expectations, and the way David's approval had become more important than my own well-being. But when I opened my mouth, what came out instead was a defense of my choices, a justification for the sacrifices I was making. "This is what success looks like," I heard myself saying, the words feeling strange and hollow even as I spoke them. "You can't understand because you've never been in this position, never had this kind of opportunity. David is preparing me for executive leadership. The Peterson account is just the beginning." Emma looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of sadness and something that might have been fear. "Honey, I've known you for 8 years. This isn't success. This is something else entirely." After Emma left that Sunday, I found myself standing in front of my bathroom mirror, really looking at my reflection for the first time in months. The woman staring back at me was a stranger. My cheekbones were sharper than they should have been. My eyes shadowed with exhaustion, my skin pale and drawn. But it was something deeper than physical changes that disturbed me. There was a vacancy in my expression, as if some essential part of myself had simply disappeared. I tried to remember the last time I had laughed, really laughed at something that had nothing to do with work. The last time I had read a book for pleasure, watched a movie without checking my phone, or spent an entire day without thinking about David's expectations. The memories felt distant, like scenes from someone else's life. Monday morning brought a crisis that would define the next phase of my relationship with David and the Peterson account. Victoria Peterson's assistant called at 7 a.m. to inform us that their quarterly board meeting had been moved up by 2 weeks, and they needed a comprehensive performance report on all their marketing initiatives by Friday. David called me into his office before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. His face was grim, his usually perfect composure showing cracks of stress that I had never seen before. "This is it," he said without preamble. "This is the test that determines whether we keep the Peterson account or lose it to one of their other agencies. Victoria is under pressure from her board to show results, and we need to deliver something that proves our value beyond any doubt." The report he described was massive, a complete analysis of every campaign we had run for Peterson Industries, complete with performance metrics, competitive analysis, and strategic recommendations for the next quarter. Under normal circumstances, it would require a team of 3 people working full-time for at least 2 weeks. We had 4 days. "I'm going to need you to clear your schedule completely," David continued, his eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "No other clients, no other projects, no distractions of any kind. This report needs to be perfect, and I mean absolutely perfect. One error, one oversight, one moment of anything less than excellence, and we lose everything." I nodded already, mentally cataloging everything I would need to cancel, everyone I would need to disappoint, but David wasn't finished. "I also need you to understand that this is bigger than just the Peterson account. The partners are watching how we handle this situation. Your performance over the next 4 days isn't just about keeping one client. It's about your entire future with this company." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. My career, my financial security, my professional identity all hung in the balance of the next 96 hours. The weight of it was overwhelming, but also familiar. David had taught me to see every project, every deadline, every interaction as a make-or-break moment. This was simply the culmination of everything he had been preparing me for. I worked through that first night, fueled by coffee and adrenaline, and the kind of desperate focus that comes from knowing there are no second chances. David stayed late as well, periodically checking on my progress, offering suggestions, and reminding me of the stakes involved. "You're doing good work," he said around midnight, looking over my shoulder at the spreadsheets and charts that covered my desk. "But good isn't going to be enough. Victoria Peterson expects brilliance. She expects insights that no one else has thought of, analysis that reveals opportunities her other advisors have missed." By Wednesday, I had been working for nearly 60 hours straight, surviving on catnaps at my desk and meals that consisted entirely of whatever someone could bring me from the office cafeteria. My hands shook as I typed, my vision blurred from staring at screens for endless hours, and my back ached from hunching over documents that seemed to multiply faster than I could process them. David's behavior during this time revealed aspects of his personality that I had never seen before. The charm and encouragement that had drawn me in during those early months were replaced by a cold efficiency that brooked no weakness, no hesitation, no human limitation. When I admitted that I was struggling to concentrate, he suggested that perhaps I wasn't as committed to success as he had believed. When I asked if we could bring in additional help, he reminded me that the Peterson team had specifically requested to work with me, and bringing in others would signal that I couldn't handle the responsibility. This is what separates the exceptional from the mediocre, he said during one of our 3 a.m. strategy sessions. Anyone can perform when they're well rested and comfortable. Excellence reveals itself when everything is on the line and failure isn't an option. I absorbed these words like gospel, using them to push through the exhaustion, the doubt, the physical discomfort that threatened to derail my focus. David had taught me that success required sacrifice, and I was finally understanding what that truly meant. Thursday night, with less than 12 hours until the report was due, I reached a breaking point that I didn't recognize at the time. I was alone in the office, the building silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. My latest attempt to format a particularly complex data visualization had failed for the 4th time, and I found myself staring at the computer screen with tears streaming down my face. The crying came from somewhere deep inside, a place that had been locked away for months under layers of ambition and determination and the relentless pursuit of David's approval. For just a moment, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I had been carrying. The isolation, the exhaustion, the constant fear of failure, the way I had disappeared from my own life. I must have fallen asleep at my desk because the next thing I knew, David was shaking my shoulder and the morning sun was streaming through the office windows. My neck ached from the awkward position, and there was a keyboard imprint on my cheek, from where my face had been pressed against the keys. The presentation is in 6 hours, David said, his voice sharp with an anxiety I had rarely heard from him. Please tell me the report is finished. It was, somehow. The final version existed in a blur of memory that felt more like a fever dream than actual work. Charts and graphs and strategic recommendations that had emerged from some deep well of determination I didn't know I possessed. As I walked David through the completed analysis, I felt a strange detachment from my own accomplishment, as if I were watching someone else deliver the presentation. This is excellent work, David said. When I finished, and for the first time in days, his expression softened slightly. This is exactly what Victoria Peterson needs to see. You've proven yourself, Sarah. You've shown that you can deliver under pressure, that you can rise to meet any challenge. The validation felt hollow, like praise for becoming something I wasn't sure I wanted to be. But there was no time for reflection. The Peterson team would arrive in 3 hours, and every detail of the presentation needed to be perfect. The meeting itself passed in a haze of adrenaline and exhaustion. Victoria Peterson and her team listened intently as I walked through each section of the report, asking thoughtful questions and taking detailed notes. By the end of the presentation, I could see approval in their faces, satisfaction with the depth and quality of the analysis. Ms. Mitchell, Victoria said as the meeting concluded, this is exactly what we needed. Your insights into our market, position, and the strategic recommendations you've outlined are going to be invaluable as we prepare for the next quarter. Thank you for your dedication to this project. After the Peterson team left, David closed his office door and turned to face me with an expression I couldn't read. For a moment, I thought he might finally offer the celebration, the acknowledgement of what we had accomplished together. Instead, he sat behind his desk and folded his hands in front of him. That was good work, he said, but I hope you understand that this level of performance is what I expect from you going forward. The Peterson account is just the beginning. There are bigger opportunities coming, bigger challenges that will require the same level of commitment. I stared at him, waiting for something more. Gratitude for the sacrifice I had made, recognition of the personal cost of what I had just accomplished, some acknowledgement that what he had asked of me went beyond reasonable expectations. But David had already moved on, his attention turning to emails and phone calls and the next crisis that would demand our immediate attention. That afternoon, I finally went home for the first time in 4 days. My apartment felt foreign, like a place I had once visited but no longer belonged. I stood in my shower for nearly an hour, letting the hot water wash away the accumulated grime and exhaustion of the week, but unable to cleanse the deeper feeling of having lost something essential about myself. I slept for 14 hours straight, a dreamless, heavy sleep that left me feeling more disoriented than rested. When I woke up, my phone showed dozens of missed calls and text messages, most of them from David, all of them marked urgent. The Peterson crisis was over, but there was already another project, another deadline, another opportunity to prove my worth. Over the next several weeks, the pattern established during the Peterson emergency became my new normal. 18-hour days were standard, weekends were working time, and every project carried the same life or death intensity that had characterized that terrible week in November. David's praise became more infrequent and more conditional, always tied to the next challenge. The next test of my commitment. My body began to rebel in ways I couldn't ignore. The persistent cough developed into something more serious, requiring antibiotics and concerned questions from my doctor about stress and sleep deprivation. I developed chronic headaches that no amount of medication seemed to touch, and my hands shook so badly during important meetings that I had to keep them clasped tightly in my lap, but the physical symptoms were nothing compared to the emotional numbness that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. I stopped feeling joy at my successes, stopped feeling disappointment at my failures, stopped feeling much of anything except the constant low-level anxiety that had become my baseline emotional state. During this time, my mother called with news that my grandmother was in the hospital. Grandma Rose had raised me during the summers when my parents were working, teaching me to bake cookies and telling me stories about her own career as a teacher in the 1950s. She was the person who had first encouraged my love of writing, who had believed in my potential long before I believed in it myself. "She's asking for you," my mother said, her voice strained with worry. "The doctors say she's stable, but she's 87, Sarah. If you want to see her, you should come soon." I wanted to drop everything and drive the 4 hours to my hometown immediately. But I had 3 client presentations scheduled for the next week, and David had made it clear that the Peterson account required constant attention. When I explained the situation to him, his response was swift and uncompromising. "I understand this is difficult," he said, not looking up from the documents he was reviewing. "But you have professional obligations that can't be ignored. Your grandmother would want you to prioritize your career, wouldn't she?" I didn't go to see my grandmother that weekend. Instead, I stayed in the office, working on presentations that could have been postponed, answering emails that weren't truly urgent, and telling myself that David was right about professional obligations. I convinced myself that Grandma Rose would understand, that she would be proud of my dedication, that there would be other opportunities to visit. She died on Tuesday morning while I was in a meeting about quarterly projections. My mother's call came through during David's presentation about market penetration strategies, and I watched my phone buzz against the conference table, seeing her name on the screen but unable to answer. When the meeting ended an hour later, I listened to her voicemail in the hallway outside the conference room. "Sarah, honey, Grandma Rose passed away this morning. She went peacefully in her sleep. The funeral is Friday. I know you're busy with work, but She was asking for you right until the end. She kept saying she had something important to tell you. I stood in that hallway for 20 minutes, holding my phone and trying to process what had happened. The woman who had shaped so much of who I was, who had believed in me unconditionally, was gone. And I had missed her final days because I was too afraid to disappoint a man who had never shown me the same unconditional love. When I told David about my grandmother's death, his response was exactly what I should have expected by then. He offered perfunctory condolences, then immediately launched into a discussion about how my absence for the funeral would affect our client commitments. The Peterson account needed attention, he reminded me. The quarterly reports were due the following week. There were opportunities that couldn't wait for personal grief. I understand this is difficult, he said, using the same words he had used when she was dying. But your grandmother wouldn't want your career to suffer because of personal loss. The best way to honor her memory is to continue building the success she would have wanted for you. I went to the funeral, but I left immediately after the service. Driving back to the city through a rainstorm that matched my internal weather, I had missed the chance to say goodbye, missed whatever important thing she had wanted to tell me, missed the opportunity to prioritize love over ambition for just one weekend dot at the reception. My family members kept asking about my work, about whether I was happy, about when they might see me again. My cousin Jennifer, who had always been more like a sister, pulled me aside as I was preparing to leave. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer, she said, her hands on my shoulders, forcing me to look directly at her. When was the last time you felt genuinely happy? Not accomplished, not successful, not praised by your boss. Actually happy. I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again. The question should have been simple, but I couldn't remember. Happiness felt like a foreign concept, something other people experienced, but that had somehow become irrelevant to my own life. I'm building something important, I said finally, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. Happiness is a luxury I can't afford right now. Jennifer looked at me with an expression of such sadness that it took my breath away. Oh, honey, she said softly, what has he done to you? The drive back to the city gave me 4 hours to think. About Jennifer's question, about my grandmother's death, about the choices I had been making for the past year. But by the time I reached my apartment, David had already called 3 times with urgent questions about client communications, and I found myself pulled back into the familiar rhythm of crisis and response that had become my life. The months that followed blurred together in a haze of endless work, impossible deadlines, and David's increasingly demanding expectations. He had begun to isolate me from other colleagues, suggesting that my work was too sophisticated for them to understand, too important to risk having others involved. I began eating lunch alone at my desk, skipping off of social events and avoiding conversations that weren't directly related to current projects. You're different from the others, David would say during our late-night strategy sessions. They're content with mediocrity, with collecting their paychecks and going home to their small lives. But you understand what it means to pursue excellence, to sacrifice for something greater than yourself. These conversations felt like oxygen to someone who was slowly suffocating. David's recognition of my dedication, his acknowledgement of my sacrifices became the validation I craved more than food or sleep or human connection. I had become addicted to his approval, dependent on his assessment of my worth, unable to see myself except through the lens of his expectations. During this time, I received a call from Emma that would force me to confront truths I had been avoiding. For months, she had been offered a job in Seattle, a dream position with a nonprofit organization that focused on environmental conservation. It was everything she had worked toward, and she was calling to share her excitement with someone who had once been her closest friend. I wanted to tell you first, she said, her voice bright with happiness that felt like a foreign language, too. My ears, I know we haven't talked much lately, but you're still one of the most important people in my life. I was hoping maybe you could visit me once I get settled. Remember how we used to talk about traveling together? I tried to summon enthusiasm for her good fortune, but all I could think about was how her absence would eliminate one of the last connections to who I used to be. Emma represented a version of myself that still believed in friendship and spontaneous adventures and the possibility that life could be about more than professional achievement. That's wonderful, I managed to say, though the words felt like stones in my mouth. I'm really happy for you. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Emma said something that cut through my carefully constructed defenses like a knife through paper. Sarah, I need to tell you something before I leave. I'm worried about you in a way that keeps me awake at night. The person I'm talking to right now isn't the friend I love. She sounds like someone who's forgotten who she used to be, someone who's lost herself so completely that she doesn't even know she's lost. Emma's words echoed in my mind for days after her call, creating cracks in the foundation of beliefs that David had helped me build. For the first time in months, I found myself questioning whether the sacrifices I was making were truly necessary, whether the person I was becoming was someone I actually wanted to be. But these moments of doubt were dangerous luxuries I couldn't afford. David had begun to sense my wavering commitment, and his response was swift and calculated. He scheduled more frequent one-on-one meetings, increased my responsibilities on the Peterson account, and began to share more personal details about his own journey to success. I see so much of myself in you, he said during one of these sessions, his voice taking on the intimate tone that always made me feel chosen, special. When I was your age, I had the same doubts, the same moments of weakness where I wondered if the sacrifices were worth it. But look where that dedication led me. Look at what we've built together. He gestured around his corner office with its expensive furniture and panoramic view of the city skyline. This was success, he reminded me. This was what happened when you refused to settle for mediocrity, when you understood that excellence required complete commitment. The people who question your choices, he continued, they're the same people who will celebrate your success. Once you achieve it, they don't understand the temporary nature of sacrifice, the way short-term pain leads to long-term gain. Your friend Emma, for example, she's taking the safe route, the comfortable path, but comfort is the enemy of greatness. These conversations became more frequent and more intense, always scheduled for times when I was exhausted, emotionally vulnerable, and most susceptible to his influence. David had an uncanny ability to sense when my resolve was weakening, when the isolation and pressure were becoming too much to bear. In those moments, he would appear with exactly the right words, the perfect balance of criticism and encouragement that kept me tethered to his vision of success. The Peterson account continued to consume every aspect of my existence. Victoria Peterson had been so impressed with our work that she recommended our services to 3 other companies in her network, each one requiring the same level of intensive attention that had characterized our original relationship. David presented this expansion as a testament to our success, proof that our methods were producing exceptional results. This is what exponential growth looks like, he announced during a company-wide meeting, his eyes finding mine across the conference room. When you commit completely to excellence, when you refuse to accept anything less than perfection, the market responds. Sarah Mitchell has demonstrated what's possible when talent meets absolute dedication. The public recognition felt intoxicating, a validation of all the sacrifices I had made. But it also meant that my workload tripled overnight, with each new client expecting the same level of service that had impressed Victoria Peterson. David made it clear that delegation wasn't an option, that these clients had specifically requested to work with me, that any attempt to distribute the workload would be seen as a failure to meet their expectations, I began to lose track of time. In more fundamental ways, days blended into nights, weekdays became indistinguishable from weekends, and months passed without my awareness of changing seasons. I lived in a bubble of artificial light and recycled air, sustained by caffeine and the periodic doses of approval that David dispensed like medication dot my physical appearance, changed in ways that shocked me when I occasionally caught glimpses of myself in mirrors or windows. I had lost 30 pounds, my clothes hanging loose on a frame that had become angular and fragile. My hair, once thick and lustrous, had become thin and brittle. Most disturbing were my eyes, which had developed a vacant quality that reminded me of photographs of people in extreme circumstances, survivors of situations that had required them to abandon parts of themselves in order to endure. During this period, my father made an unexpected visit to my office. I hadn't seen him in nearly 6 months, and his reaction to my appearance was immediate and visceral. He stood in the lobby of our building, looking at me with an expression of shock that quickly transformed into something that might have been horror. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what has happened to you?" I tried to brush off his concern, to explain that I was simply busy with important work, that success required sacrifice, that he wouldn't understand the demands of my industry. But my father had worked in corporate environments for decades, had climbed his own ladder of professional achievement, and he knew the difference between dedicated work and something darker. "I've seen ambitious people," he said as we sat in a coffee shop near my office, his hands wrapped around a cup he wasn't drinking. "I've seen people push themselves hard to achieve their goals, but I've never seen someone disappear the way you have. You look like you're haunting your own life." He begged me to take time off, to come home for a few days, to step back and gain some perspective on what was happening to me. But I couldn't risk David's disappointment, couldn't risk losing the momentum we had built, couldn't risk proving that I was just another person who lacked the commitment necessary for true success. "Dad, I appreciate your concern," I said, checking my phone for the messages that had been arriving steadily throughout our conversation. "But you don't understand the opportunities I have right now. David is grooming me for partnership, for a level of success that most people never achieve. I can't walk away from that because I'm tired." My father looked at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with a sadness that I didn't understand at the time. "Success that costs you your soul isn't success at all," he said finally. "It's just expensive failure." That evening, David called me into his office for what he termed an important conversation about your future. I expected another discussion about new opportunities, additional responsibilities, perhaps even the partnership he had been hinting at for months. Instead, he closed the door and turned to face me with an expression that immediately put me on edge. "I had an interesting visit today," he said, settling into his chair with deliberate slowness. "Your father stopped by to speak with me about his concerns regarding your work schedule and overall well-being." The blood drained from my face as David's words registered. My father had gone behind my back, had interfered with my professional relationships, had made me look weak and unreliable in front of the person whose opinion mattered most. The betrayal felt complete and devastating. "I want you to know that I defended you," David continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering disappointing news. "I explained to your father that you were a consummate professional, that your dedication was exactly what this industry required, that interference from family members was inappropriate and potentially damaging to your career. I felt a surge of gratitude that was immediately complicated by shame. David had protected me from my father's misguided concern, had stood up for my choices when my own family wouldn't support them. But the fact that this conversation had been necessary, it all felt like a personal failure. However, David said, and I knew that everything that had come before was simply preparation for what he was about to say next. I need to know that you're completely committed to this path we've chosen together. The kind of external pressure your father represents, the doubts and concerns of people who don't understand what we're building here, can be incredibly destructive if you allow them to influence your thinking. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. I need to know that you understand the choice you're facing. You can have the career we've been building, the success that's within, your reach, the partnership that could set you up for life. Or you can listen to people who would rather see you settle for mediocrity, who are more comfortable with your failure than your excellence. The choice he presented felt stark and absolute. On one side was everything I had worked for, everything. I had sacrificed to achieve everything that made sense of the pain and isolation of the past 2 years. On the other side was the concern of people who loved me but who couldn't possibly understand the world I was trying to succeed in. I'm completely committed, I heard myself saying, the words emerging from some deep place of desperation that I didn't want to acknowledge. My family doesn't understand this industry, doesn't understand what's required to succeed at this level. You've been more supportive of my career than anyone in my life. David smiled, but there was something cold in his expression that I had never noticed before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. I'm glad to hear that, he said, because I have some news that's going to require that level of commitment from you. The news was that Morrison and Associates had been selected to handle the marketing launch for Peterson Industries' new product line, a contract worth over $2 million spread across 18 months. It was the kind of opportunity that could define a career, the kind of success that would validate every sacrifice I had made. But the timeline was aggressive, the expectations were unprecedented, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic, not just for me, but for the entire company. David made it clear that I would be the primary point person for the entire campaign, responsible for coordinating with multiple departments, managing a team of specialists, and maintaining the kind of perfection that Victoria Peterson had come to expect. This is your moment, David said, his voice carrying the weight of everything we had built together. This is what all the preparation has been leading to. The late nights, the sacrifices, the commitment to excellence over comfort, everything depends on the next 18 months. I accepted the responsibility with the mixture of terror and exhilaration that had become my normal response to David's challenges. This was what I had been training for, what justified every choice I had made, every relationship I had sacrificed, every part of myself I had abandoned in pursuit of professional achievement. The project began immediately, consuming not just my days, but my nights, weekends, and every moment of mental energy I possessed. David's management style during this period became even more intensive, with daily check-ins that lasted for hours, detailed critiques of every decision I made, and constant reminders of how much was at stake. Perfection isn't negotiable, he would say during our marathon planning sessions. Victoria Peterson chose us because she believes we can deliver something extraordinary. One mistake, one oversight, one moment of anything less than excellence, and we lose not just this contract, but our reputation in the industry. The team I was supposed to be managing quickly became another source of stress rather than support. David had selected them based on their specific expertise, but he insisted that all major decisions flow through him, effectively making me a messenger rather than a true leader. When team members brought concerns or suggestions directly to me, I was required to present them to David for approval, then relay his responses back to them. This structure created confusion and resentment among the team members, who began to question my authority and competence. David's response to these concerns was to remind me that leadership meant taking responsibility for everything that went wrong, while giving credit for everything that went right to the people above and below me. This is how you learn to manage, up and down simultaneously, he explained during one particularly difficult week when 2 team members had requested transfers to other projects. Real leaders don't need titles or formal authority to get results. They earn respect through competence and dedication. But the respect he was talking about never materialized. Instead, I found myself increasingly isolated, caught between David's impossible expectations and a team that saw me as either incompetent or complicit in their mistreatment. The stress of managing these competing pressures while maintaining the perfect facade required by our clients began to manifest in physical symptoms that I could no longer ignore. I developed chronic insomnia that left me functioning on 2 or 3 hours of sleep per night. My hands developed a tremor that made it difficult to write or type accurately. Most disturbing was the way my memory began to fail me in small but significant ways, forgetting appointments, losing track of conversations, or finding myself in meetings with no clear recollection of how I had gotten there. During this time, I received a letter from Emma, who had settled into her new life in Seattle and was writing to check on my well-being. The letter was filled with descriptions of her work, her new friends, the hiking trails she had discovered, and the sense of purpose she had found in her environmental advocacy. Reading about her life felt like looking through a window into a world I could barely remember believing was possible. Emma's letter ended with an invitation that felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in deep water. She was organizing a weekend retreat for women in environmental careers, and she wanted me to come as her guest. It would be 2 days of hiking, workshops, and conversation with women who had found ways to balance professional achievement with personal fulfillment. I know you're busy with work, she wrote, but I keep thinking about our conversations in college about the kind of life we wanted to build. We used to talk about success as something that included happiness, creativity, and meaningful relationships. I worry that you've forgotten those dreams, and I'd love to help you remember them. The invitation arrived on a Friday afternoon when I was preparing for yet another weekend of Peterson project work. David had scheduled a Saturday morning meeting to review our latest presentations, followed by a Sunday session to plan the following week's client communications. The idea of taking an entire weekend away from work felt impossible, irresponsible, and terrifying, but something about Emma's words penetrated the armor of professional obligation I had built around myself. The mention of our college dreams, the life we used to imagine building, stirred memories of a person I had once been, a person who had believed that success could include joy, that achievement could coexist with authentic relationships, that professional growth didn't require the complete abandonment of personal identity. I found myself standing in David's office that Friday evening, holding Emma's letter and trying to find the courage to ask for something I had never requested in 2 years of working together. Time off for personal reasons? Absolutely not, David said before I had even finished explaining the situation. The Peterson project is entering its most critical phase. We have 3 major deliverables due next week, and Victoria has scheduled a strategy session for Monday morning that will determine the trajectory of the entire campaign. I had expected this response, but hearing it still felt like a physical blow. The certainty in his voice, the complete dismissal of my request, the way he looked at me as if I had suggested something not just unreasonable, but actively destructive to everything we had built together. I understand the timing isn't ideal, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but I haven't taken a single day off in over a year. I'm starting to make mistakes because I'm so exhausted, and I think a brief break might actually help me perform better. David leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully about your answer. Do you believe that Victoria Peterson takes weekends off when her company's future is on the line? Do you think the executives at our competing agencies are taking time off to go hiking with their college friends? The questions felt like traps, each one designed to expose the selfishness and unprofessionalism of my request. Of course, successful. People didn't take breaks during critical periods. Of course, personal desires had to be subordinated to professional obligations. Of course, my exhaustion and stress were signs of weakness rather than legitimate concerns. You're right, I said, folding Emma's letter and putting it back in my purse. I wasn't thinking clearly. The Peterson project has to be the priority. But David wasn't finished. He had sensed something in my request that went beyond simple fatigue, something that threatened the complete control he had established over my professional and personal choices. I'm concerned about what this request reveals. About your mindset, he said, his voice taking on the disappointed tone that always made me feel like I had betrayed something sacred. For 2 years, you've understood that excellence requires sacrifice, that success demands complete commitment. But now you're suggesting that your personal desires are more important than our professional obligations. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to me as he continued speaking. I've invested tremendous time and energy in your career development. I've given you opportunities that other people would kill for, trusted you with responsibilities that typically go to people with twice your experience. But that investment is predicated on your understanding of what's required to succeed at this level. The guilt was overwhelming, a crushing weight that made it difficult to breathe. David was right about everything he had done for me, all the opportunities he had provided, all the faith he had shown in my potential. My request for time off wasn't just selfish. It was a betrayal of everything he had sacrificed to help me succeed. I'm sorry, I said, the words coming out in a rush of shame and desperation. You're absolutely right. I lost sight of what's important. The Peterson project is the priority, and I won't let personal distractions compromise our work. David turned back to face me, his expression softening slightly. I'm not trying to be harsh, he said, using the gentle tone that always followed his most devastating critiques. I'm trying to protect you from making choices that would damage everything we've built together. Success at this level requires a different kind of thinking, a willingness to prioritize long-term achievement over short-term comfort. That weekend, while Emma was leading her retreat in the mountains of Washington, I spent both days in the office, working on presentations that could have been completed the following week, responding to emails that weren't truly urgent, and trying to convince myself that I had made the right choice. But something had shifted during that conversation with David. Some small crack in the foundation of beliefs that had sustained me for 2 years. For the first time, I found myself questioning not just his specific decisions, but the entire framework of sacrifice and dedication that he had taught me to embrace. The questioning was dangerous, and I knew it. David had warned me about the destructive power of doubt, the way that questioning the path to success could become a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure. But the questions persisted, growing stronger with each passing day, each impossible deadline, each reminder that my entire sense of self-worth had become dependent on the approval of one person who seemed increasingly impossible to please. The crack in my foundation widened over the following weeks as I began to notice things about David's behavior that I had previously accepted without question. The way he spoke to other employees when he thought no one was listening, the casual cruelty with which he dismissed their ideas and contributions. The pattern of selecting promising young employees, building their dependence on his approval, then discarding them when they could no longer sustain the impossible standards he imposed. started paying attention to what had happened to my predecessors, the talented people who had occupied my role before burning out or being pushed out. There was Jennifer Walsh, who had suffered a nervous breakdown during a major presentation and left the company on medical leave, never to return. Mark Stevens, who had been found sleeping in his car in the office parking lot because he was too exhausted to drive home safely. Lisa Chen, who had achieved remarkable success on a pharmaceutical account before being blamed for a client's decision to reduce their marketing budget. Each of these stories followed the same pattern: exceptional initial performance, increasing isolation from colleagues and family, mounting pressure and impossible expectations, then sudden collapse and departure. David's response to these departures was always the same: disappointment and their lack of commitment, regret that they hadn't possessed the strength necessary for true success, an immediate recruitment of someone new to fill their role. I was seeing this pattern clearly for the first time, but I was also trapped within it. The Peterson Project had become my entire professional identity, and walking away would mean abandoning everything I had worked for, everything that gave my life meaning and structure. David had taught me to see any questioning of our methods as a sign of weakness, any desire for balance as evidence of inadequate commitment to excellence. But the physical and emotional toll was becoming impossible to ignore. I had developed chronic stomach problems that made eating difficult and painful. My hair was falling out in clumps, leaving bald patches that I tried desperately to conceal. Most frightening was my increasing inability to concentrate on complex tasks, as if the cognitive overload of the past 2 years had damaged some essential part of my brain's functioning. During this time, Victoria Peterson made an unexpected visit to our office for what she described as a routine check-in on our progress. I prepared for the meeting with the obsessive attention to detail that had become my standard approach, creating backup presentations for every possible direction the conversation might take. But Victoria's demeanor during the meeting was different from what I expected. Instead of the focused intensity I had come to associate with our interactions, she seemed almost concerned, asking questions about my workload, my team, and my overall well-being in ways that felt more personal than professional. "Sarah," she said as the formal presentation concluded, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you look exhausted. Are you taking care of yourself?" The question caught me completely off guard. For 2 years, David had taught me that clients valued dedication above all else, that any sign of personal struggle or limitation would be seen as unprofessional weakness. But Victoria's concern seemed genuine, as if she understood something about the cost of the work we were doing together. "I'm fine," I said automatically, the response so practiced that it required no conscious thought. "The project has been demanding, but I'm committed to delivering the best possible results." Victoria studied my face for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "I've been in this industry for 25 years, she said finally, "and I've learned that sustainable excellence requires balance. Burnout doesn't serve anyone's interests, including the client's. Are you getting the support you need from your team?" The question was another surprise. David had trained me to present our work as my individual achievement, to take personal responsibility for both successes and failures. The idea that I might need support, that the project might be too large for one person to manage effectively, was something I had never been allowed to articulate. "The team has been very supportive," I said, sticking to the script David had taught me. "Mr. Chen has provided excellent guidance throughout the project." But Victoria wasn't satisfied with these generic responses. She asked specific questions about team dynamics, about decision-making processes, about the distribution of responsibilities across the project. Her questions revealed a sophisticated understanding of project management that highlighted How unusual our approach had been after the meeting. David called me into his office with an expression that immediately put me on edge. He closed the door and turned to face me with the kind of controlled anger I had learned to fear more than his overt criticism. "What did you say to Victoria Peterson about our team structure?" he asked without preamble. I recounted the conversation as accurately as I could remember, but David's expression grew darker with each detail I provided. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his desk, in the rhythm that always signaled his deepest displeasure. "Victoria Peterson called me after your meeting," he said finally. "She expressed concerns about your workload and suggested that we might need to bring in additional resources to support the project. Do you understand what you've done?" I didn't understand, but I could see from David's face that I had made some terrible mistake. The approval I had thought I was earning had somehow been transformed into evidence of my failure, my inability to handle the responsibilities he had entrusted to me. By appearing overwhelmed in front of our most important client, David continued, "You've undermined the confidence she has in our ability to deliver. You've made her question whether we have the resources and competence to handle projects of this magnitude." The criticism felt like a physical assault, each word landing with precision designed to inflict maximum damage. I had thought I was being professional, responsive to her concerns, appropriately grateful for her attention. Instead, I had revealed weaknesses that threatened everything we had built together. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. I didn't mean to give her the wrong impression. I thought I was being appropriately responsive to her questions. David's expression softened slightly, shifting from anger to disappointment, which was somehow worse. "Sarah, I know you didn't intend to cause problems, but this is exactly why I've been trying to teach you about managing client perceptions, about presenting strength even when you're facing challenges." He walked around his desk and sat in the chair next to mine, his physical proximity making the conversation feel more intimate and therefore more devastating. "Victoria Peterson needs to see us as completely in control, absolutely competent, capable of handling anything she might require. The moment she starts to question our capabilities, she starts looking for alternatives." The weeks following Victoria Peterson's visit marked a new phase in my relationship with David, one characterized by even more intensive oversight and control. He instituted daily debriefing sessions where I was required to account for every hour of my time, every client interaction, every decision made without his direct input. These sessions often lasted well past normal business hours, extending into evenings that I had once hoped to spend recovering from the day's stress. "I need to understand exactly what happened with Victoria," David said during one of these sessions, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child. "Your inability to project confidence during that meeting has created a crisis of trust that we need to actively repair." The solution he proposed was a complete restructuring of my role, with even more direct oversight and less independent decision-making authority. Every email to Peterson Industries would be drafted by me but sent by David. Every meeting would be attended by both of us, with clearly defined roles that positioned him as the strategic leader and me as the detail-oriented implementer. "This isn't a punishment," he explained, though it felt exactly like one. "This is about rebuilding the confidence we need to maintain this relationship. Victoria needs to see that you have strong supervision, that every aspect of this project is being managed by someone with the experience to handle her expectations." The new structure was humiliating and exhausting, requiring me to produce twice as much work while having half as much authority over the final product. I found myself writing detailed reports and presentations that David would then revise extensively, often changing not just the content but the fundamental approach I had taken to various challenges, but the most devastating aspect of this new arrangement was the way it confirmed my deepest fears about my own competence. If I had been performing adequately, David wouldn't need to exercise such close control over my work. If I had truly earned Victoria Peterson's confidence, she wouldn't have questioned our team structure. The increased oversight was evidence of my failure, proof that I wasn't yet ready for the level of responsibility I had been given. During this period, I received an unexpected phone call from my college advisor, Dr. Margaret Rodriguez, who had been a mentor during my undergraduate years and had written one of my recommendation letters for my current job. She was in town for a conference and wanted to take me to lunch to catch up on my career progress and hear about my experiences in the corporate world. I tried to decline, citing the demanding schedule of the Peterson Project, but Dr. Rodriguez was persistent in the gentle way that had made her such an effective teacher. Sarah, it's been over 3 years since we've spoken. I'd love to hear about your successes and challenges. I'm sure you can spare an hour for someone who cares about your professional development. We met at a quiet restaurant near the university, and I was shocked by my own appearance in the mirrored walls of the dining room. The woman reflected there bore little resemblance to the confident graduate student Dr. Rodriguez had once known. I had lost so much weight that my professional clothes hung loosely on my frame, and there were dark circles under my eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal. Dr. Rodriguez's reaction to my appearance was immediate and concerned. She had known me during some of the most challenging periods of my academic career, had seen me struggle with difficult coursework and demanding professors, but she had never seen me look so worn down, so depleted of the energy and enthusiasm that had once defined my approach to challenges. Sarah, she said after we had ordered our meals, I need to ask you something directly. Are you happy with your career choice? Are you finding fulfillment in the work you're doing? The question should have been simple to answer. I was working with prestigious clients, handling campaigns worth millions of dollars, building the kind of resume that would open doors throughout the industry. By every objective measure, I was succeeding in ways that most people my age could only dream of achieving. But when I tried to articulate my satisfaction with my work, the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself launching into a detailed description of the Peterson Project, the challenges of managing high-stakes client relationships, the learning opportunities that came with working for someone as experienced and demanding as David. Dr. Rodriguez listened patiently, but I could see something shifting in her expression as I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee with the kind of deliberate movements that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. You know, she said finally, I've had many students go into corporate careers, and I've heard a lot of different descriptions of professional success. But I've never heard someone describe their work the way you just did, with such focus on pleasing one person, with such emphasis on avoiding disappointment rather than achieving satisfaction. Her words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were accurate in ways I hadn't allowed myself to recognize. When I talked about my work, I didn't describe projects I was proud of or achievements that brought me joy. Instead, I talked about David's expectations, David's approval, David's assessment of my performance. In graduate school, Dr. Rodriguez continued, you used to light up when you talked about projects you were working on. You had opinions, creative ideas, a sense of ownership over your intellectual contributions. What you're describing now sounds more like someone who's lost confidence in her own judgment. I wanted to defend my current situation, to explain how much more complex and demanding the corporate world was compared to academic work, how much I had learned about the realities of professional success. But sitting across from someone who had known me before David entered my life I was confronted with the stark reality of how much I had changed. The work I'm doing is important, I said finally, though even to my own ears the words sounded hollow. David has taught me so much about what it takes to succeed at the highest levels of this industry. Dr. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. I'm sure he has. But I'm curious about something. When you think about your career 5 years from now, what do you see? What are your goals independent of his expectations? The question revealed something terrifying. I couldn't envision a future that didn't revolve around David's approval and guidance. My professional identity had become so intertwined with his assessment of my worth that I couldn't imagine success that wasn't defined by his standards. That evening, after my lunch with Dr. Rodriguez, I sat in my apartment trying to remember the last time I had made a decision based on my own desires rather than David's expectations. The exercise was more difficult than I had anticipated, revealing the extent to which my sense of self had been subsumed into his vision of who I should become. I found an old journal from college, one I had kept during my senior year when I was full of dreams and ambitions for my post-graduation life. The woman who had written those entries felt like a stranger, someone who had believed in her own judgment, who had ideas and opinions and plans that belonged entirely to her. I want to work on campaigns that make a difference, I had written in one entry. Not just selling products, but helping organizations that are trying to solve real problems. I want to use marketing to educate people, to inspire them, to create positive change in the world. The idealism felt naive now, but there was something in those words that stirred a memory of who I had once been. A person who had believed that success could be aligned with values, that professional achievement could coexist with personal integrity, that career growth didn't require the complete abandonment of independent thought, but these reflections were dangerous luxuries I couldn't afford. The Peterson project was entering its final phase, and David had made it clear that the next 6 weeks would determine not just the success of this campaign, but the trajectory of my entire career. Any distraction from that focus, any questioning of the path we were on together, could jeopardize everything I had worked so hard to achieve. The final presentation to Peterson Industries was scheduled for a Friday morning in early March. Exactly 18 months after we had first been awarded the contract. David had spent weeks preparing for this moment, orchestrating every detail of the presentation with the precision of a military operation. This is your moment of truth, he said during our final preparation session, his eyes boring into mine, with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. Everything we've built together, everything you've sacrificed, everything you've learned about what it takes to succeed at this level, it all comes down to the next 2 hours. The presentation itself was flawless, a comprehensive demonstration of everything we had accomplished over the past year and a half. The campaign had exceeded every performance metric, generated unprecedented brand awareness, and resulted in the most successful product launch in Peterson Industries history. Victoria Peterson and her team listened with obvious satisfaction, asking detailed questions that revealed their appreciation for the depth and sophistication of our work. But David's behavior during the presentation revealed aspects of our working relationship that I had never allowed myself to acknowledge. He took credit for every strategic decision, every creative insight, every successful innovation, presenting my contributions as competent execution of his vision rather than collaborative achievement. When Victoria Peterson specifically praised my analytical work, David redirected the conversation to the guidance he had provided, the framework he had established, the oversight that had ensured quality control. When she asked about my role in developing the campaign's messaging strategy, he explained how he had mentored me through the process, how my work had improved under his direction. By the end of the presentation, I felt invisible, reduced to a footnote in the story of David's success. The 18 months of sacrifice, the abandoned relationships, the compromised health, the complete reorganization of my life around this project, all of it, had been transformed into evidence of his leadership rather than my achievement. After the Peterson team left, David closed his office door and turned to face me with an expression of satisfaction I had rarely seen from him. "That went perfectly," he said, settling into his chair with the relaxed demeanor of someone who had just accomplished something significant. "Victoria was clearly impressed with our results, and I think we can expect to see additional opportunities from her network." I waited for some acknowledgement of my contribution, some recognition of the personal cost of what we had just accomplished together. Instead, David began outlining plans for leveraging our success with Peterson Industries into additional contracts, bigger opportunities, higher stakes challenges that would require even greater commitment. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice taking on the evangelical tone that had once inspired me but now felt oppressive. "The success we've demonstrated here is going to open doors throughout the industry, but that success is also going to come with expectations, with pressure, to prove that this wasn't just a lucky accident." The conversation continued for over an hour, with David mapping out a future that looked exactly like the present: longer hours, higher pressure, greater isolation, and increasing dependence on his approval for any sense of professional worth. As he spoke, I felt something inside me begin to crack, not gradually this time, but all at once, like ice giving way under too much weight. "David," I said, interrupting him mid-sentence for the first time in 2 years. The sound of my own voice surprising him, surprising myself, felt like the first authentic thing I had done in months. He stopped talking and looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly started speaking. "Yes, I need to ask you something," I said, my heart pounding so hard I was certain he could hear it. "In all the time we've worked together, and all the success we've achieved, have you ever once asked me what I want, what my goals are? What kind of career would make me happy?" The question hung in the air between us, and I watched David's expression shift from annoyance to confusion to something that might have been anger. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of clinical attention he usually reserved for problematic clients. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "We've spent 2 years building your career, developing your skills, positioning you for opportunities that most people never get. What more could you want?" "I want to remember who I was before I met you," I said, the words emerging from some deep place of truth I had been afraid to access. "I want to have friends, relationships, interests that exist outside of your approval. I wanted to make decisions based on my own judgment instead of constantly second-guessing myself against your expectations." David's face went through a series of expressions, settling finally on something that looked like disappointment mixed with contempt. "Sarah, I think you're having some kind of breakdown. The pressure of the Peterson project, the intensity of the work we've been doing, it's clearly affecting your judgment." He stood up and walked around his desk, positioning himself between me and the door in a way that felt both protective and threatening. "Let me remind you of something," he said, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when explaining basic concepts to people he considered intellectually inferior. 2 years ago, you were nobody. A recent graduate with potential, but no experience, no connections, no real understanding of what it takes to succeed in this industry. I gave you opportunities that other people would kill for. I invested my time, my reputation, my professional relationships in your development. I taught you everything you know about strategic thinking, client management, and high-stakes campaign development. Without my guidance, you would still be working on small accounts for insignificant clients, wondering why your career wasn't advancing. Each word felt like a carefully aimed blow, designed to remind me of my dependence, my debt, my fundamental inadequacy without his intervention. But instead of the familiar shame and gratitude his criticism usually provoked, I felt something different, anger. You're right, I said, standing up to face him directly. 2 years ago, I was inexperienced. But I wasn't nobody. I had ideas, creativity, enthusiasm, and the ability to connect with people authentically. I had friends who cared about me, family relationships that brought me joy, and interests that made my life feel full and meaningful. David's expression shifted again, this time to something that looked almost predatory. "And what do you have now?" he asked, his voice soft and dangerous. "Professional success, financial security, industry recognition, and opportunities for advancement that will set you up for life. Are you really willing to throw all of that away because you're feeling nostalgic for your college friendships?" "What I have now," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice, "is a life I don't recognize, relationships I've destroyed in pursuit of your approval, and health problems that will probably take years to recover from. I have professional success that feels hollow because I can't remember why I wanted it in the first place." The silence that followed was unlike any we had ever shared. David stared at me with an expression I couldn't read, his usual confidence replaced by something that might have been uncertainty. For the first time in 2 years, I had said something he wasn't prepared for, expressed a perspective he couldn't immediately counter with logic or emotional manipulation. "I see," he said finally. "So this is how you repay everything I've done. For you, the moment you achieve success, you decide that the person who made it possible is the problem.